There's a painful reality worth examining directly when it comes to narcissistic parents, and it's one that can be difficult to accept precisely because we instinctively expect a parent's feelings toward their children to operate according to an entirely different emotional logic. We expect unconditional attachment, protection, pride, and a willingness to place the child's needs ahead of the parent's ego. But when narcissistic patterns dominate the relationship, the child's position can become very different. Today, we're going to examine 5 thoughts that can exist beneath the surface of a narcissistic parent's relationship with their children, not as literal sentences every narcissist consciously thinks, and not as a claim that every parent with narcissistic traits thinks identically, but as recurring psychological patterns that can help explain behavior that otherwise seems deeply confusing. And the first one is perhaps the most uncomfortable. The first thing, my child is an extension of me. This is fundamentally different from healthy parental pride. A healthy parent can feel proud of their child's achievements while still understanding that the child is a separate human being with separate preferences, values, emotions, and ambitions. A narcissistic parent may struggle with that separation. The child's success can feel like evidence of the parent's own worth. The child's failure can feel like an embarrassment directed personally at the parent. The child's appearance can become a reflection of the parent's status. The child's career can become a symbol of the parent's success. Even the child's personality may become something the parent feels entitled to shape according to their own preferred image. This creates a subtle but powerful problem. The child isn't simply being raised, the child is being evaluated, and the evaluation often has less to do with who the child genuinely is and more to do with what the child communicates about the parent. That's why a narcissistic parent can appear incredibly proud of a child when that child is achieving something impressive, while becoming strangely cold, critical, or dismissive when the same child begins making choices the parent doesn't approve of. The emotional message becomes, when you reflect well on me, I feel connected to you, and when you challenge the image I want to maintain, I experience you as a problem. This can be incredibly confusing for a child because the love appears conditional without anyone explicitly announcing that it is conditional. The child simply learns the pattern. When I succeed, I'm celebrated. When I disagree, I'm criticized. When I make the parent look good, I'm valuable. When I become independent, I'm difficult. And eventually, the child may begin organizing their entire identity around maintaining parental approval. That's where the second thought becomes important. The second thing, your independence feels like rejection. This is one of the most damaging misunderstandings in narcissistic parent-child dynamics. Healthy parenting naturally moves toward separation. The child grows. The child develops opinions. The child makes friends. The child chooses interests. Eventually, the child becomes an adult with a life of their own. A healthy parent may experience some sadness during this process, but they can ultimately celebrate the child's independence. A narcissistic parent may experience independence very differently. The child's growing autonomy can feel like loss of control. The child doesn't ask for permission anymore. The child doesn't reveal everything anymore. The child doesn't automatically accept the parent's version of reality. The child starts making decisions without consulting them. And suddenly, what should represent healthy development can be interpreted as betrayal. The child may hear, "You've changed. You don't care about your family anymore. Who put these ideas in your head? You're becoming selfish. After everything I've done for you." These statements may sound like ordinary parental disappointment on the surface, but underneath them can be a deeper psychological demand. You are supposed to remain emotionally organized around me. That's the problem. The parent may not consciously think those exact words, but their behavior can communicate that message repeatedly. And when the child begins creating healthy distance, The parent may interpret that distance as disrespect rather than development. This is why adulthood can become such a major turning point. The child isn't necessarily becoming cruel, they're becoming separate, and separation is exactly what a controlling parent may struggle to tolerate. The third thing, I need my child to validate me. This is where the relationship can become emotionally reversed. Instead of the parent consistently providing emotional security to the child may gradually become responsible for regulating the parent's emotions. The child learns when to compliment, when to reassure, when to stay quiet, when to avoid certain subjects, when to protect the parent's image, when to absorb the parent's frustration, when to make the parent feel important. And because children naturally depend on their parents, they can become extremely sensitive to these emotional demands. A child might think, if mom is upset, I need to fix it. If dad is angry, I must have done something wrong. If my parent is disappointed, I need to make them proud again. This can create what feels like love, but functions more like emotional responsibility, and the older child becomes, the more complicated it can get. The parent may expect the adult child to provide constant reassurance, to listen to endless complaints, to take sides in family conflicts, to validate every grievance, to defend the parent's behavior. And when the child stops doing that, the parent may accuse them of being ungrateful. This is where the phrase, after everything I've done for you, can become especially powerful, because gratitude is healthy. But gratitude doesn't create permanent emotional debt. A parent choosing to raise a child doesn't mean the child owes lifelong obedience. Love doesn't mean surrendering adulthood. And appreciation doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. The fourth thing is perhaps even more revealing. I know who my child really is. A narcissistic parent may become extremely attached to a fixed story about their child. The good child, the difficult child, the successful child, the ungrateful child, the sensitive child, the problem child. Once that role becomes established, everything the child does may be interpreted through it. If the child succeeds, the parent may say it was because of them. If the child fails, the parent may say they were always irresponsible. If the child establishes a boundary, it may be interpreted as selfishness. If the child stays quiet, it may be interpreted as hostility. The child can begin to realize something deeply unsettling. No matter what I do, the story about me doesn't change. And this is why arguing over the label often doesn't work. If someone has already decided that you're the difficult one, producing 10 examples of reasonable behavior may not change their interpretation, because they're not necessarily evaluating every event independently. They're fitting each event into an existing narrative. That can create enormous psychological exhaustion for the child. You keep thinking, how do I prove I'm not who they say I am? But perhaps the healthier question eventually becomes, why am I still trying to earn freedom from a label someone else created? You don't have to accept another person's definition of you simply because they are your parent. You can know yourself independently. And that leads directly to the fifth thought. My child should remain loyal to my version of reality. This is where disagreements can become especially explosive. Every family has different memories. Every parent and child can remember events differently. That alone isn't narcissism. But in unhealthy dynamics, disagreement itself can be treated as disloyalty. You remember something differently. They insist your memory is wrong. You describe how something affected you. They tell you you're too sensitive. You question their behavior. They remind you of everything they've sacrificed. You establish a boundary. They call it disrespect. And slowly, the child learns that having an independent reality creates conflict. So they begin doubting themselves. Maybe I did misunderstand. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe I'm remembering it incorrectly. Maybe I should just let it go. This is where self-trust can become damaged over time, because children depend on adults to help them interpret the world. When that adult repeatedly invalidates the child's perception, the child may learn to distrust their own internal signals, and that lesson can follow them far beyond childhood. They may become adults who constantly ask others, "Was I wrong? Am I overreacting? Is this actually okay? Am I being selfish? Should I apologize?" That's why understanding the psychological pattern matters. Not so you can diagnose your parent, not so you can spend your entire life analyzing their hidden thoughts, but so you can recognize what the relationship may have taught you about yourself. Because sometimes the deepest damage isn't simply what the parent said. It's the internal voice the child eventually develops because of what the parent repeatedly said. And once you recognize that voice, you can begin separating it from your own. The criticism may have become internal. The guilt may have become automatic. The need for approval may feel like personality. The fear of disappointing people may feel like kindness. But learned patterns can be unlearned, and the adult child can eventually reach a point where they can say, "I can love my parent without accepting every version of reality they give me. I can appreciate what they did for me without surrendering my autonomy. I can understand where their behavior came from without excusing its impact. I can maintain compassion without abandoning myself." And perhaps that's the most important distinction in this entire conversation. Understanding a narcissistic parent's psychology isn't about proving that they secretly hate their children. Often, the reality is more complicated. A person can have attachment to their child and still relate to that child in profoundly unhealthy ways. They can feel pride and still be controlling. They can love their child in their own way and still repeatedly harm the child. Human psychology is complicated enough to hold contradictions. So don't reduce everything to the question, "Does my parent love me?" Sometimes the more useful question is, "Does the way this relationship functions allow me to feel safe, respected, separate, and emotionally free?" Because love without respect can still hurt. Love without emotional safety can still create fear. Love without room for individuality can become control. And love that requires you to disappear in order to preserve someone else's emotional stability isn't the kind of love you have to keep proving yourself worthy of. The real transformation begins when the child who once believed, "I have to become whatever my parent needs me to be," eventually becomes the adult who can say, "I am allowed to become who I actually am." And that is where the next part of this conversation becomes even more important, because once the child stops performing the role assigned to them, the narcissistic parent's internal response can become much more revealing. And this is where the relationship can begin to change in ways the child may not initially understand. Because once a child stops automatically performing the role assigned to them, the parent is forced to confront something they may have spent years avoiding. This is a separate human being, not an extension of themselves. The sixth thought is, why isn't my child responding the way they used to? This question can become especially important when the child reaches adulthood. For years, the parent may have known exactly what would produce a reaction. Criticism produced an explanation. Guilt produced compliance. Anger produced fear. Withdrawal produced pursuit. Disapproval produced another attempt to earn approval. The pattern became predictable, and predictability creates a sense of control. But then something changes. The adult child doesn't argue. They don't plead. They don't immediately apologize. They don't try to convince the parent that they're still a good son or daughter. They simply say, "I understand, that's how you see it," and continue living their life. That response can feel completely unfamiliar to someone accustomed to emotional control because there is nothing obvious to grab onto. The parent may increase the pressure. Maybe they become more critical. Maybe they remind the child of sacrifices. Maybe they bring up the past. Maybe they accuse the child of changing. But if the child has genuinely developed emotional independence, the old cycle doesn't produce the same result. This is one reason adulthood can become such a revealing stage in these relationships. The child has more choices, more perspective, more resources, more ability to compare the family dynamic with relationships outside the family. And suddenly, behaviors that once seemed normal begin looking very different. What once felt like love may now look like control. What once felt like concern may sometimes reveal itself as intrusion. What once felt like parental guidance may sometimes have been an inability to tolerate the child's autonomy. And that realization can be deeply painful, because recognizing an unhealthy pattern doesn't automatically remove the emotional attachment. You can understand something intellectually and still feel grief about it emotionally. You can know a relationship isn't healthy and still wish it were different. You can establish a boundary and still feel guilty afterward. You can love a parent and still need distance. Those contradictions don't mean you're confused, they mean you're human. The seventh thought is, if my child succeeds without me, what does that say about me? This is where the child's independence can become psychologically threatening to a parent whose self-worth is strongly tied to being important, superior, or necessary. A healthy parent can eventually say, "My child doesn't need me in the same way anymore, and I'm proud of that." A narcissistic parent may struggle with the emotional transition. If the child becomes successful without following the parent's advice, the success can become difficult to integrate. If the child becomes confident without the parent's approval, that can be even more uncomfortable. If the child creates a healthy relationship the parent cannot control, the parent may question it. If the child becomes financially independent, emotionally stable, or socially confident, the parent may suddenly lose one of the mechanisms through which they previously felt important. And sometimes this produces a strange combination of pride and resentment. The parent may publicly celebrate the child's achievement while privately minimizing it. Yes, they're doing well, but of course they succeeded. I gave them everything. They wouldn't have gotten there without me. The achievement cannot simply belong to the child. It must somehow return to the parent's identity. Again, this isn't about claiming every proud parent is narcissistic. Parents naturally feel connected to their children's achievements. The distinction is whether the child's success is allowed to belong to the child. The eighth thought is, why doesn't my child need my approval anymore? This may be one of the most painful transitions for a narcissistic parent, because approval can function as a form of emotional currency. When the child desperately wants approval, the parent has leverage. A compliment can be given, then withdrawn. A gesture of affection can be offered, then withheld. The child learns to work for emotional security. But eventually, some children reach a point where they stop participating. They realize, my parent may never approve of this. And instead of changing the decision, they make it anyway. That is a major developmental shift. It doesn't mean becoming disrespectful. It means recognizing that adulthood requires internal authority. You can listen to advice without surrendering your decision. You can hear criticism without automatically changing. You can consider a parent's opinion without treating it as the final verdict. And when that happens, the parent's approval loses some of its power. This can produce what looks like sudden conflict. The parent may say, "You don't listen to me anymore." And the adult child may think, "You're right. I listen, but I decide for myself now." That distinction is enormous, because healthy adulthood isn't rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It's differentiation. You become capable of saying, "I respect you, but I am still responsible for my own life." The ninth thought is, my child is becoming someone I can't control. This is where boundaries become especially important. A boundary isn't an attack, but someone who experiences another person's autonomy as rejection may interpret it that way. The adult child says, "Please call before coming over." The parent hears, "You aren't welcome." The child says, I'm not discussing my relationship. The parent hears, "You're hiding something from me." The child says, "I've made my decision." The parent hears, "You don't matter." This is why some narcissistic family dynamics become so exhausting. The child is communicating independence. The parent experiences independence as disrespect, and then the child is forced into defending a completely reasonable need. This is where you have to remember something. A boundary doesn't become unreasonable simply because someone reacts badly to it. If someone becomes angry because you won't give them unrestricted access to your private life, their anger doesn't automatically make your boundary wrong. Their reaction is information. It tells you something about how they experience your autonomy. And sometimes that information is uncomfortable. The 10th thought is, if I can't control my child's choices, I can influence how they feel about those choices. This is where guilt can become particularly powerful. Instead of directly saying, "Do what I tell you," the message may become, "After everything I've done for you, I guess I'm not important to you anymore. You've forgotten your family. You've become selfish. You'll understand when I'm gone." These statements can activate the child's deepest emotional vulnerability because children naturally care about disappointing their parents. Even adult children can carry that sensitivity for decades. So the child begins changing their behavior simply to avoid guilt. They may visit when they don't want to. They may agree when they disagree. They may hide decisions. They may avoid relationships the parent dislikes. They may sacrifice opportunities. And from the outside, it can look like family harmony. But underneath, resentment grows because the adult child isn't freely choosing connection. They're managing emotional consequences. And eventually, that becomes unsustainable. The 11th thought is, if my child sees the family differently, they may expose things I don't want acknowledged. This is especially significant when the family has long maintained a particular narrative. Perhaps one child has always been labeled the problem. Perhaps another has been treated as the perfect one. Perhaps certain conflicts are never discussed. Perhaps everyone is expected to pretend everything is fine. Then one child begins asking questions. Why did that happen? Why was I treated differently? Why are we not allowed to talk about this? What actually happened? That questioning can destabilize the family system, not because questioning is inherently destructive, but because silence can preserve dysfunctional patterns for years. When someone finally refuses to participate in the silence, everyone else has to decide whether they're willing to examine what has been avoided. And sometimes the easiest response is to make the questioning child the problem. You've become obsessed with the past. You're trying to destroy the family.